Today we're going to start time period 2 for APUSH. In chapter 1, we looked at the first time period, which begins with pre-Columbian contact in 1491, the native groups that occupied North America and the different regions and their characteristics. And we looked at Spain's tribute colonies, the ones where they were extracting those resources for Spain's profit, whether it's the gold or the silver, and then also the impact that they had trying to convert natives to Catholicism. Time period 2 is going to establish the other European colonies in North America, and we will focus primarily on the English colonies, the various regional groups of colonies, and how they're unique and how they're somewhat different from one another. So as we work through chapter 2, where we establish these new colonies, there will be a number of important foundational documents that we reference. And most of those we're going to be going over in the live sessions that we have during the week. But I also want to introduce them here, but the actual text we will focus on more in class. So let's go ahead and get started. And begin to look at chapter 2. Okay, here we go. So notice the time period again, 1521. We will begin to start looking at some of the early exploration along the Atlantic coast before permanent settlements were created. And then we will go up through about 1700, where we begin to see some more conflict break out within England, and the colonists begin to sort of define themselves economically in the various regions. So we've already talked about the Spanish tribute colonies, as I mentioned, and that would have been that first section of chapter 2. Here in the second section, we're going to establish a different type of colony. These will be known as the plantation colonies, where you have settlements that are going to be created for large-scale operations, whether it's agricultural production, like the sugar in Brazil. We've already talked about those sugar plantations in Brazil, whether it's the tobacco in Jamestown in Maryland, the sugar operations that also will develop in the Caribbean islands in south of North America. All of those are going to be operations that are going to rely on the extraction of some commodity from the colony that's going to be produced and manufactured for economic gain in England. So it's not as much about getting the groups of people who lived in the colony, as the Spanish did, to turn over tribute. Tribute, it would be like payment or some sort of agreement between the two sides. This is something that's quite different, and it will also rely on large-scale labor acquisition, whether it's native labor, whether it's enslaved labor that comes in pretty quickly into the region for the sugar and the tobacco plantations. Labor intensive is also another main characteristic of these plantation colonies. So as we've already mentioned, those sugar plantations in Brazil were very, very intensive operations, where you had the harvest of the sugar, and because of the span of time that it would take to get it to market, you had to go ahead and refine it and process it right there on the plantation. So you have this new mechanical operation that's also going to be tied in with the heavy agriculture on one big plot of land. So the English attempts were initially quite unsuccessful, and this began in the earlier time periods where Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth I were trying to establish, some sort of control, exploring what was happening on that Atlantic coastline. This is a map that was eventually created by John White. We mentioned his watercolor paintings in chapter 1. This was one of his paintings that is showing what we would today call North Carolina coastline, but at the time it was all one big colony of Virginia. And he has shown the various communities that will begin to develop along the rivers that will move into what today is referred to as the Outer Banks. I don't know if you've ever been to the Outer Banks or not, the series of islands off of the coast of North Carolina. But the first attempt at trying to plant a colony of Englishmen here to live and to settle was at Roanoke Island. And Roanoke Island would have been off that coast of North Carolina. John White was actually the governor of Roanoke Island and was there for close to a year. His family was there. His daughter actually gave birth to the first child born, English child born in North America, and her name was Virginia Dare. And John White ended up leaving and going back to England to try to secure supplies. And when he came back, the entire settlement was gone. It had disappeared. And that's been a mystery ever since the colonial time, is what happened to this lost colony of Roanoke. And I wanted to point out this map in particular because there's been some recent scholarship. In 2012, this particular document is housed in the permanent collection at the British Museum in London. And they were beginning to look at these maps. And if you look closely right in here, it almost looks like there's a piece of paper over another piece of paper. And that's over the original layer of the map. And that is actually true. When these map makers, you couldn't do it on computer and then erase something and correct your mistakes. So if they were creating these maps and they wanted to correct a mistake, they would just overlay another small piece of paper and bind it together and continue with their map. Well, what these historians in 2012 began to notice when they were looking at these maps in different kinds of light with new technology is that there seemed to be something underneath. And when they used X-ray technology, you can see that underneath this square that's been added in, it almost looks like a star. And then with even more refined technology, they were able to see that this was an X that had been placed on the map. And what they are suggesting is that when this early settlement of Roanoke was being first planned out, they had known that they needed to move farther to the interior, right? This coastline here is going to get battered by the tides and by bad weather, probably also be a little bit more vulnerable to Spanish attack. So what these historians, as late as 2012, have decided is that probably this was a planned location for the settlement to move. Now, I mentioned in chapter 1 that when John White went back to England for more supplies, he got caught up in the middle of this war between Spain and England, and the Spanish Armada was blocking the English ships, and he wasn't able to come back for about 3 years. So when he came back, what historians are thinking now is that as things got rough, maybe the colony tried to move into this interior area a little bit sooner, and maybe that was what happened to that lost colony. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at these particular documents from hundreds of years ago and know that historians are actually still doing work. The story is not complete. We don't have a full understanding of everything that went on. So the lost colony of Roanoke was England's unsuccessful colony. The first permanent settlement in the new English colonies would be at Jamestown. So in 1607, Jamestown was first established. I want to show you this short clip from the History Channel that talks about the risk that the colonists were taking as they were embarking on this journey.
To get by ship from England to Jamestown in 1607, you have to traverse more than 3,000 miles of the worst ocean in the world, the North Atlantic, in a really small wooden vessel, terribly cramped, terribly crowded, eating salt or spoiled food, drinking water with creatures in it. And what's even more remarkable is at the end of the journey, you're going to find yourself in an unknown territory, stretching unknown distances in every direction except the ocean. and there's the ocean between you and home. It's an extraordinary risk to just make the leap into the unknown and plant yourself there.
Ultimately, the goal simply was survival. This was a wilderness, to put it mildly. The living conditions couldn't possibly have been worse. And there were Native Americans living here who appeared to be the enemy, and everybody was trying to kill each other. That colony barely survived.
When the first settlers reached the shores of North America, in Virginia, in Massachusetts, the thing that struck them was the effectively unlimited extent of natural resources. They knew that the forests went back as far as anyone had ever been. They knew that there were fish in the rivers. They knew that there was enough land for generation after generation after generation of farmers. The mindset changed on the moment that the English colonists landed in America. Until then, natural resources were a restraint. Now, natural resources were a liberation.
The next thing you have to know about Jamestown is more people keep coming over. And the ones who come over later know something that the first ones didn't know, and that is that almost half of them are likely to die from local diseases to which they are not acclimated, and from other things, their own bad food, their own bad sanitation, and ultimately hostility from the Indians, whom they've antagonized by their presence. And yet people do keep coming.
They were either fleeing religious persecution, they were fleeing poverty, they were fleeing a ceiling that said if you're not an aristocrat, you can't rise. And so there's a real sense of greater freedom here than anywhere else in the world. And a freedom that's not just political, but it's also a freedom to become somebody, a freedom to rise, a freedom to acquire property in a way that did not exist in the more structured and medieval societies around the world.
All right. One issue that I have with that film clip is that they showed the small child, and they showed some of the women. And in the earliest settlement at Jamestown, that's not totally accurate. So again, as we look at documents, we want to try to, again, always look for potential problems, or if we're watching video clips, we want to make sure that we're getting the full story. And I'll show you in a minute why I think that clip is somewhat flawed. All right, so we need to go back and establish the colony of Jamestown and why it was settled. And the king at the time was James the First. Obviously, that's going to be why Jamestown is named Jamestown. He is going to give a company a charter, and a charter is like a permission or a claim to go and establish this colony in the name of England, and they can operate it how they wish as long as England is getting its share of the commodities that are coming back. So if we look at this charter, so the charter was first given in 1606, and then the colony is actually established in 1609 when they first arrived. But notice the boundaries. So really, this southern part of where North Carolina, so this is imposed in here, a map of the current United States. But these two lines along here are the ones that would be the boundaries of what would be the English settlement. Below this line, this was all claimed by Spain, because remember, De Soto and Columbus, excuse me, had settled here in the Caribbean, and they had claimed Florida, or what today we would call Florida, with the settlement at St. Augustine, and they had traveled here through this southern area. So this is all Spanish claim. This is going to be the English claim that goes up to today what would be kind of New Jersey, New York, that area. And then beyond that will eventually be the claims of France. So again, this is kind of a rough land plan or claim for the Virginia Company, as it was called. And they're going to name the colony, or name the grant of land Virginia, and they name that to honor Queen Elizabeth I. She was the one who had the rivalry with the Spanish and went up against the Spanish Armada, and they claimed the treasure ship with Francis Drake and all of that. She never married and never had children, and therefore she was referred to as the Virgin Queen. And so that's why Virginia is named for Queen Elizabeth in her honor. So the Virginia Company is a corporation, and to establish this colony was going to be incredibly expensive and very risky. And the initial purpose here was to find gold. Think about all of this silver and the gold that Spain has brought out of their claim in New Spain, and then also down in the Andes in South America. So that is well known. Spain has made a fortune in this, and people are assuming, well, there must be gold everywhere in North America, and off they go to try to get rich quick. So this was kind of like a scheme to come to North America, find this gold, and return back to England. There really wasn't this intent of permanent, large settlements with large populations. And it was risky because of the expense. And so they created what were known as joint stock companies, where you would have investors. If you and I were investors, we might put in $100 a piece. We would pool all of our money together with, lots of other investors, and that's what would finance the voyage. So why did they set it up this way? If this is all about finding gold and getting rich quick, it would seem like the Virginia Company would want to keep all of that for itself. So think about, why might the joint stock company be necessary for them to establish this colony? Well, of course, it's to reduce the risk. If they go here and they find nothing, or they're attacked by natives and they're unsuccessful, or maybe the ship sinks as it's crossing the ocean, it's like a 4-month journey. If that happens, then all of the money would be lost. So it reduces the risk for everybody, but then the reward or the profit is also going to be divided among everybody. So it's kind of this risk-reward balance that people were trying to establish. So the charter is in place, the Virginia Company has their investors, and they set out for Jamestown. So it was a 4-month voyage, and they do indeed establish the colony here. But it's a little different from what we saw in the video. There were very, very few women who were in that initial settlement at Jamestown. These were all men. These were adventurers who were trying to get rich quick. Think back to something that we discussed in chapter 1. We talked about the concept of primogeniture, which was when wealthy families in Europe passed their fortunes down. It all went to the oldest son. Those younger sons within the family really were not entitled to anything of their wealthy father. So what we find is that many, not all, but many of the first men or adventurers who came to Jamestown were these younger sons from these wealthy aristocratic families. So how much hard labor and work do you think that those young men had ever really engaged in their lives? They lived on their father's fancy estate. They had servants who did all the work for them. They were not farmers. They were not carpenters. They weren't skilled really at anything other than being wealthy. So here they come to Jamestown, which is in the wilderness. There's no settlement that's already there. They land. They expect to step off of the ship and trip over big boulders of gold, and they're going to just scoop it up, get back on the boat, and come back home, and then they don't have to rely on Big Brother anymore. They're going to have their own wealth and their own fortune. And if it doesn't work out that way, are they any worse off than they would have been being the younger brother in these wealthy aristocratic families? Probably not. So when they first established this colony at Jamestown, they already had some problems, because you had people who weren't skilled in survival, and they weren't willing to do hard work. They wanted somebody else to do that hard work for them. So it really was a problem. And there were native groups in the area, large numbers of native groups. So as archaeologists have put together, based on writings of some of the colonists who were in these early settlements, and some of the archaeological digs that they've done along this coastline, this is our best guess as to what the settlement actually looked like. They put together this palisade, or this fortification, that was in the shape of a triangle right here along the tidal waters, and it was a terrible location. This is kind of brackish water. This is where the salt water meets the fresh water. So you really didn't have a good, safe water supply. It was a swampy area, so there were terrible problems with disease and the insects that would have been carrying, like mosquitoes carrying malaria and that kind of thing. And there were natives that lived in this frontier area. So you can see that they've got these fortifications and these lookout posts that are built up in each corner, and then kind of the village in between. They almost didn't make it. And we know that there was a very, very dangerous time. So they arrive in 1607. They're trying to sort things out. New groups of settlers come each year, and they're all just dying off because they're not willing to do the hard work to set up their farms, right? These men who arrive in Jamestown's first settlement, they're looking for gold. That's what they're headed out to find. And they don't want to plant crops and prepare for the winter. They want to just get the gold, get on the boat, and go back to England. Didn't play out that way. So there's an area of science that's called dendrochronology. And chronology, obviously, you're looking at a time span, and you can trace weather conditions and climatic features through the rings of trees. And we know, I think you've probably learned this in the past, that if you count the rings on a tree, you can count how old, you can determine how old that tree is. So without cutting down these old trees, what you can actually do is bore a hole. Okay, so here's the tree trunk. You're able to bore a hole into the tree and pull out a plug of wood, and then you're able to look at it and count the rings. So each ring, you've got a light area and then a dark area. This is representing the growing season. So the light area is during the growing season, or the warm months where the vegetation is thriving and growing. And then when you've got the winter months where there's less, where there is less growth in the vegetation, then that's the dark ring. So a light and a dark together represents 1 year's time of the tree. And the wider the ring, that indicates more rainfall. So if we can look at these years that move through here, and this is a tree that is from this coastal area where Jamestown was located in Virginia. If we look at and count back, so here's the center of the tree. They believe that this tree was first a seedling in 1531. So we move out here, here's 1607, right? So here's when Roanoke would have been established, and look how close together these rings are. Could that have been a factor why people died off at Roanoke? Maybe there was a massive drought. But look what goes on here. Here's 1607 to 1612. These are incredibly close together. So there was a terrible drought, and we refer to this as the starving time. There are accounts coming out of Jamestown, even of cannibalism, where some of the people who died, and it was very, very desperate and devastating what went on there. Now, there are some interesting players who are involved in the story of Jamestown. You've got John Smith. You have the Indian chief of the entire, he was a paramount chief, and we'll talk about that in just a second. His name was Powhatan, Powhatan. You have Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, Opechancanaugh, I believe. And then we have Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, who you've probably heard of from the Disney story. And then you have John Rolfe. So I want to kind of lay out who all of these individuals are. So when things got so bad in Jamestown, and you've got the starving time and nobody's willing to work, John Smith steps up as a leader. And he said, enough. None of us will survive unless everybody does their part. So he takes what food supplies they have, he puts it together, puts a padlock on it. He alone is in charge of that food. And he issues this policy that he who shall not work shall not eat. So in other words, he's taking control of this. And obviously he's going to be resented by some of these aristocratic men who feel like that they deserve more. So he's going to be part of the story. Then you have Powhatan. So here's Powhatan, a depiction of what he may have looked like. And he was from one of the Algonquin tribes of Indians here in the eastern woodlands of North America. And he was and we talked before about a chiefdom versus a confederacy. He is what we refer to as a paramount chief. He is the chief who's over like 30 different other tribes of the region. He's about 60 years old, as best we can estimate, which for that time period, to live to be 60 years old was incredible. He was revered by all of the tribes. He was very, very much in power and in control of this coastal area of Virginia. One of the ways that, and this is going to seem a little unusual to us as I mention it, but one of the ways that the paramount chief is symbolically creating an alliance, if you want to call that, among these 30 different tribes is by taking a wife in each one of the tribes. So Powhatan had 30 or 31 different wives, and he had a child by each one of those wives. And think about why that might have been done. If he's got a wife and a child who is tied directly to a particular tribe, this is symbolically representing that he's going to maintain peace and work to protect that tribe. And that sounds, shocking to us today to think about, that he would have 30-something wives and have children with each one of these wives within those tribes. But if you think about what the English monarchs did, the European monarchies, they all intermarried as well. And they did this as military or political alliances. If you've got the King of England and his son marries the Princess of Spain, then that's going to formalize this relationship between them and make it more peaceful. So that's essentially what Powhatan was doing there. Now, Powhatan had, when the English first arrived, he was skeptical, of course, but he basically took a very peaceful approach to the English settlers. He kept them at a distance, didn't totally trust them, but he also didn't attack them because he believes that there can be some sort of benefit to these Englishmen who are arriving on his shores. They have new tools that Powhatan and the other leaders might be interested in. He's going to work to trade with them. So where the English are desperate for food, Powhatan and the other tribes, these would have been the farming tribes of the eastern woodlands, they're going to make some trade arrangements. They're going to help to provide food. They're going to help to show the English what will grow here and how to grow it in the time periods to make that happen. And in return, Powhatan's going to get what he wants, which will be metal tools. He's going to get some guns. He's going to also get metal pots that are going to make cooking a little bit easier. So he's leery of them, but he also works with them in a peaceful way. Now, his brother, this is a depiction of what we think Opechancanough may have looked like. Opechancanough totally disagreed with his brother, who is the paramount chief, in how to handle the English. Opechancanough is worried. He's like, you've got to take care of these people encroaching on our society. You need to take care of it now before their numbers grow. So the two brothers disagreed on how to handle the English, but Opechancanough didn't have any authority because his brother was the paramount chief, and he was simply a warrior who was not making the decisions. And then you have Pocahontas, and this was Powhatan's favorite daughter. And in many of the writings, even among the tribe, the Powhatan tribe, she's referenced as his favorite daughter. And if you think about it, well, what makes her special? What makes her the favorite? Well, Pocahontas's mother was the primary wife of Powhatan. This is the woman who Powhatan loved. This was his wife that he chose, not out of a political alliance, but because that's who he wanted to spend his life with. So Pocahontas's mother was the primary wife of Powhatan, and she died during childbirth, giving birth to Pocahontas. And so, Pocahontas has older brothers and sisters, but she was the one who was the youngest. She looked just like her mother, who Powhatan had loved so much. And she was spoiled rotten because this was the last tie that Powhatan had to this woman who he loved. So she was spoiled, and she did, roam around and really wasn't disciplined by her father and the other members of the tribes. Kind of resented the fact that she just got away with everything, and she could do no wrong in her father's eyes. All right, now we need to deal with the Disney story of Pocahontas, and I'm thinking that you've probably somewhere along the way seen the Disney story of Pocahontas, where they make it seem like John Smith and Pocahontas fall madly in love together. That did not happen. Did not happen. Pocahontas was probably like 8 or 9 years old when the English arrived at Jamestown. She was not in love with John Smith. He was not in love with her. Now, did the two interact? Probably. Pocahontas did learn English, and I think that this is something that you need to be clear on, is that she was used by the tribe for a number of ways to interact with the English. One of the ways is she began to learn English pretty quickly. And young children, their brains are developing in a way that acquiring language skills is pretty easy. So it's easier for a young child to learn a second or third language than it is for an adult. So Pocahontas was kind of in that age range where she was curious about the English. She picked up English words. They learned Indian words from her. So that was kind of a unique development. The other situation, if we go back to the settlement here, where you've got these fortifications at each corner, if the Indians are coming out of the woods towards the settlement of Jamestown, how are the Englishmen supposed to know that the natives came in peace? And supposedly what happened is the Indians, when they would come to the Jamestown settlement for trade or whatever purpose that they were arriving that day, Pocahontas would be with them, and they would put Pocahontas in the front as they come out of the woods. If they were there to attack the Jamestown settlement or kill the Englishmen, why would they have a child in the front of the Indian group that's coming out of the woods? So again, she was used in that way as well. All right, so fast forward a little bit, and Pocahontas will eventually marry this man, John Rolfe, and he arrives in the colony. So after the starving time, it looks like Jamestown is going to collapse. There's been no gold that's been found. So it looks like the whole colony is going to be lost and not be productive. Well, when John Rolfe shows up, he's actually been down in the Caribbean, and he's brought with him these tobacco seeds, and they take off. And it is a very sweet form of tobacco, not familiar to anyone in Europe. And so when they send these samples of tobacco back to Europe, oh my gosh, people just, are completely overcome with this new tobacco that's coming out of Jamestown, and they want more of it. Obviously, they become addicted to it, and the demand becomes very great. And so Jamestown ultimately does become a very, very successful colony and a very lucrative colony for the English, not because of gold and silver, but because of tobacco that begins to grow there. So John Rolfe has brought these tobacco seeds. They take off, and he's pretty successful. Pocahontas does end up marrying John Rolfe. Now, there is question about whether that was by choice or whether she was forced to. John Smith, he was, like I said, not well liked by the settlers. He also was in an accident where gunpowder exploded in this barrel, and he was burned very badly. He didn't die, but he ended up going back to England after that accident. So when Pocahontas marries John Rolfe, they make her more European. Her name becomes Rebecca. She speaks English. She converts to Christianity. She dresses like an English woman. This is Pocahontas right here. So she is married to John Rolfe. They have a child together. His name is Thomas. And everyone in Europe is just so curious about these natives in North America. So John Rolfe, Pocahontas, AKA Rebecca, and the baby Thomas go back to England, and she's just kind of like, this celebrity spectacle that everybody wants to get a glimpse of, this Indian princess who has come to London. And while in England, they were there for a number of months. While in England, she gets sick and she ends up dying while she is in London. The baby is going to be raised by some of the English relatives of John Rolfe. He comes back to the colonies. So there are descendants of Pocahontas today because the baby Thomas does survive. Now, that's the English side of the story. This little book, I don't know if you can see this. Okay, it's called The True Story of Pocahontas, The Other Side of History. And it's actually written by her tribe. So the oral history of her tribe paints a totally different story of Pocahontas. And what they end up saying in this book is that she was forced to marry John Rolfe to maintain peace between her tribe and the English, and that she sacrificed herself in order to do that. They claim in the book that she was already married, that she had married one of the warriors within one of the tribes that her father was the paramount chief of, and that she already had a child with this warrior, her husband, whom she loved very much, but that she was kidnapped and that she was forced into this marriage with John Rolfe. And that she remained in that marriage simply to keep the peace. And then the question becomes, why would her father allow her to be kidnapped? And again, at that point, his Indian tribes have been greatly outnumbered, and the English have more weapons, and it would have been a slaughter if he had gone in to try to rescue his daughter. And he was devastated, according to this book, that had happened. All right, he ends up dying. So when Chief Powhatan died, his younger brother, Opechancanough, became the chief, and that took place in 1621. So in 1621, Opechancanough is now the new chief. Well, he, of course, does not approve at all of the English being there, and he puts together a war party of all of these different tribes, of which he's now the new paramount chief. And they go after the English. And these are the Indian Wars of 1622. So you might want to make reference to that, the Indian Wars of 1622. So it's a very different way of relating to the English when Opechancanough becomes the paramount chief. And they go in and they kill right around 350 of the English settlers, which was about a third of the population that was still living at that time. And it was just a complete disaster. By that time, there were more women in the colony. It wasn't just the men, but it was just a very, very brutal war, these Indian War of 1622. So by that point, the English are going to take a different approach here. There's a new king. The new king is, we've got James, who had initially granted the charter, and he now is going to revoke the charter after these Indian Wars and make this into a royal colony. So no longer is the Virginia Company making decisions for the colony. It's now going to be the king. And so with this, the king will appoint a governor to go and monitor what's going on in the colony, kind of be his person on the ground there. You're going to have an elected assembly, so the people living there will still have some local governing ability. There's going to be a legal system, and they're going to formalize the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, as being required of the people living in the Jamestown or the Virginia colony. This becomes a model for other royal colonies that are set to be established. All right, so I want to also show you some of these incentives that the Virginia colonists will have to take this risk, to go across the ocean. And that's going to be free land. And I would really, really, really emphasize this in your notes, that why would people take this risk? Well, it's free land. So once there was no gold discovered, now you can go and get free land. Think about England. It's this teeny tiny little island in the North Atlantic with very few resources, but a very large population. And so to have your own land was almost impossible. That's where we had the manor systems, and people were required to work for others. So if you came to the colonies, you would be given 100 free acres of land. That would have never been possible in England. So if you can just get yourself to North America, you'd be able to determine your own economic destiny. Then they also were able to amass huge plots of land through something called the headright system. Let's say that I couldn't afford to pay to get myself to Virginia. I could do what's known as becoming an indentured servant, which we'll talk more about in just a minute, to get myself to the New World. And by indenturing myself, I promised to work for a period of like 3 to 7 years, somewhere in there. I think the average was about 5 years. I would work for whoever had paid my way. So somebody's going to pay for my passage on the ship. When I get to North America, I'm going to work off the debt that I owe them. Well, if I was the person who had paid for you to get here, not only do I get your labor for this period of time, but I'm also going to be given an additional 50 acres of land for paying for you to come over here. So I've got my original 100 acres. I've got another 50 acres for bringing someone over here. And if I had a lot of money, I could very quickly amass thousands of acres of land that I control, and I have a built-in labor supply because of these indentured servants who are bound to work for me for a period of about 5 years or so, 5 to 7 years. What better arrangement is that? Okay. They also had their own local government. Most of these people living in England didn't have the right to vote or elect people to Parliament. It was all the aristocratic set, the people with money, who were able to have power and voting rights and make rules and policy within England. So here, the House of Burgesses, and I would highlight this in your notes, the House of Burgesses is the name of their legislature. So this was the Virginia legislature, where people in Virginia elected representatives to go and make policies, local policies within the community. So there were advertisements, people came, and once they were able to make money, and once they were starting to farm, then, the population began to increase. So if we go back and we look at, this is a good document here, and it's taken from the records of John Smith. And if we look at what John Smith had to say about the groups of people who first came. So in 1607, this was the very first group of settlers who arrived at Jamestown. And we've got a breakdown of their occupations. There were a total of 110 men and 0 women. So as we go back and we look at this ship's manifest from John Smith, who was there, it's very clear that there were no women. Look at their occupations. We had 6 governors, right, or councilmen, so these would have been aristocrats, 47 gentlemen, So what does it mean to be a gentleman in 1607? Well, it means that you're rich. Okay, so these are gentlemen or people of wealth not used to working with their hands. We've got 4 carpenters. Well, hallelujah, we've got 4 carpenters who may be able to do a little something, but only out of 110. There's only 4 people who might be able to know where to begin to build a house or something like that. 1 blacksmith, 1 sailor, a barber, because really that's clearly important to have here in this new colony. 1 bricklayer, 1 brick mason who knows how to make it, a tailor so that our clothes can look fine, a drummer, a preacher, 4 young men, 1 surgeon. Well, that's good news, right? Since we're going to be dealing with malaria and everything else. And then 28 of unknown occupation, which probably means they didn't have an occupation and they would have been part of that gentleman class. When we talked about that starving time, if any of these carpenters or the surgeon or somebody had died, these folks were in trouble. Okay, so again, this is not a group of people who are planning ahead of time to deal with difficult conditions in this new colony. Then the next shipment of settlers arrives the following year. And look, we've got more of the same. We do have 21 laborers. Well, that's good to know. But more gentlemen, 6 tailors this time. We've got some goldsmiths, but they're not going to find any gold. We've got a jeweler to make all this gold into jewelry, but no gold. So again, things are not going to be going well. And again, no women. So this is again indicating to us that this was not meant to be a permanent type of settlement. You don't have families that are coming to Jamestown. Okay, another colony that develops in the Chesapeake region, and this is a term that I find every year that most kids are not familiar with. When we talk about the Chesapeake, there are 2 colonies that are part of the Chesapeake. One is Virginia, and the other is Maryland. And it's called this because of the Chesapeake Bay. So here's the Atlantic Ocean, and this body of water is the Chesapeake Bay. And then all of these rivers, the James River and the others, will go inland, and that's where those settlements are going to be established. So Maryland is the other new colony that will form in the Chesapeake, and it's going to be established in 1632. When we have a new king, Charles I, so after James dies, then Charles, a new king, Charles, is going to come in the 1630s. And this is going to be given to one of his friends. All right, so Charles is secretly sympathetic to the Catholics. He had married the Princess Henrietta Maria of France. She was a Catholic woman. So it was known that the king had kind of these sympathies towards the Catholic Church, even though the Church of England was by law established and required when Henry VIII created it during his reign and his 8 wives and all of that. So when Maryland was first created, the new king, who is secretly sympathetic to the Catholics, is going to give the colony to Cecilius Calvert. So here is Cecilius Calvert, and his title is the Lord Baltimore. So he's a very wealthy aristocrat with a lot of power, and he's pretty well connected to the new king. And the king gives him this colony as a gift. And we're going to call those types of colonies proprietary colonies. If you are the proprietor of something, it means you're the owner of it. So the owner of this colony is the Lord Baltimore, Cecilius Calvert. He can do anything he wants to with this colony. And when he first comes to Maryland, it's going to be a refuge or a place for Catholics to come and live freely and not be persecuted in England. Well, let's think back. Tobacco has recently become a hot commodity in Europe. You're making a lot of money. And if tobacco grows here in the Chesapeake, won't tobacco also grow here in the Chesapeake region? So this becomes very quickly a tobacco growing colony. And the Catholics are outnumbered very, very quickly. And they are they're worried that, and the Lord Baltimore is worried that they are going to once again be persecuted. So Baltimore tries to protect his Catholic followers by saying, okay, fine, all of these people who are moving to Maryland, this Maryland tobacco producing colony, you can set up your own government. That's fine. You can have your local legislature, just like we saw with the House of Burgesses in Virginia. But the requirement to do that, this is going to be kind of a compromise between the Catholic Lord Baltimore and the non-Catholic leaders who are setting up a government in Maryland, is that the legislature will pass this law called the Maryland Act of Toleration. And what this law does is it will give all Christians, so that's Catholic or Protestant, all Christians will have the right to worship freely in Maryland. So this colony starts out as a religiously planted colony, but it quickly shifts to becoming one of the tobacco growing colonies of the Chesapeake. But it kind of has this foundation of religious toleration as long as we're talking about Christians. Now, you couldn't come into Maryland and worship freely if you were Jewish or if you were Muslim. That all had to, you had to all be Christians if you were going to go into the colony. So let's finish up this look here at the labor force that's going to be very important for both Maryland and Virginia, and those would be indentured servants. So before you left England, you would sign this indenture or this contract between yourself and whoever's paying your passage. So this is one, this was actually from a little bit later. This goes on even into the 1700s. But look at what's happened. This guy, Patrick Larkin, is saying that he, in consideration whereof the said covenant and grant, this is a promise, that Patrick Larkin with the this other guy, it looks like Thomas Blood, I believe is his name, will pay this passage and to find food, drink, apparel, and lodging, and other necessities during the said term. So as long as Patrick Larkin is going to promise to do this work, then in return, Thomas Blood is going to provide food and lodging and other necessaries for the term that they've agreed to. So the indenture is this contract. Then when the time period is up, Patrick Larkin would be given his full freedom. He was supposed to be given a little bit of land and some clothing to move on into his own independent life. That didn't always happen. This form of indentured servitude will last for a period of time, but then they will be replaced. Indentured servants are going to be replaced as the main labor force by the time we get to the mid to late 1600s, right? So here in the 1670s to 1690s, we start to see this trend change where African labor will be brought in with the slave trade, and it skyrockets as we move here into the 1700s. And we'll be talking more about that later on. So the native population, they're going to drastically decline in what becomes the English colonies, partially because of warfare, partially because of disease. And then the non-Indian population goes up dramatically. So as the Indian population declines, the non-Indian population, whether it's European or enslaved Africans, will go up dramatically. So here's why people would agree to it. You've got push factors for indentured servants to say, I'm willing to take this risk. I'm willing to work off this debt in the New World because of the problems that they had in England, right? So this is what's pushing them to leave England. The poverty, the disasters there, the unemployment, things were not good. They were being targeted, right? If you were a religious dissenter, you were being targeted. So all of those things would push you to want to leave. Well, what's pulling them to say, I think I'm going to go to North America rather than to go to another country in Europe, it's because of the opportunity that existed in the colonies. You had freedom with some form of self-government. You had opportunity, financial opportunity, and land available to you. This was a much better arrangement. So these pull factors brought them to North America. These are the factors that force people to want to leave England. Okay, as we move into some of the other colonies that become North America, this is in this third section of chapter 2. I want us to look at the settlements here by European control. So clearly the Spanish still really control this region here in the Caribbean. They've got the islands in the Caribbean that are under their control. They have established St. Augustine in Florida. They control this area that used to be the Aztec and the Incan Empire. You've got the English that have Jamestown here in Virginia and Maryland that will be developing, okay? So then you've got so these are the British colonies. The British are also going to take control of the former Dutch colonies, which would be, and we'll talk more about those later, New Netherland, and then the Swedish people, New Sweden, also had their own colony here. That will all be taken over by the English. And then you have the French that will establish their colony here along the St. Lawrence River, and eventually will control this whole area in the interior around the Mississippi River. So these new colonies that we're going to talk about today, New France, New Netherland, and New England, are initially set up not as tribute colonies, not as plantation colonies, but to replicate European society. So in these European societies, New France will be established at about the same time that Jamestown was. So Jamestown was 1607. The first permanent settlement of the French will be at Quebec, and it's established in 1608. Prior to that, there was an explorer, Jacques Cartier, who was looking for the Northwest Passage. The French were not terribly interested in what the Spanish were doing here in North America with the gold and the silver. The French were more interested in establishing more trade arrangements with the people of Asia. The silks, the spices that had come out of their knowledge of the East, the Orient, that had come from the Crusades, that's where they want to establish trade routes. And going through the Mediterranean and having to pay those Italian merchants that were kind of the gatekeeper of what was going on there in the East, that wasn't something that they wanted. And by this time, they knew that the world was round, and they assumed that if you sail west from Europe, that eventually you would come back around to Asia. Rather than going through the Mediterranean, if we sail west, let's find this Northwest Passage, okay? They know that Spain has established this colony here in North America. But again, this is what has been mapped. This is what has been mapped by John White here in these earlier periods with the Roanoke colony. Well, what the French were assuming is that this land mass has to end somewhere. And if you sail far enough north, then you're going to have wide open ocean and you're going to end up in Asia. So they are looking for a Northwest Passage. That's their goal. Their goal here is not to establish a colony. So as Jacques Cartier is sailing and sailing and sailing along this coastline, he gets to this area right here, and all of a sudden it opens up. And he believes, this is it. I have found the Northwest Passage. So as they're sailing in here, they begin to go in a more southerly direction, and it narrows into a river. And it's pretty clear by that point that they have not found the Northwest Passage. So Jacques Cartier, he maps it out. They go back to France. This is not really something that they're going to pursue more. Right? So the French are going to claim it, that this is their land, this wide open body of water here, but they're not really going to do much with it until we get to 1608, with Samuel D. Champlain, because as some of these other French explorers have come into the region, they start to interact more with the native groups. And the native groups are very eager to trade with the French. They're trading guns for beaver pelt and animal furs. And so they're going to sell like crazy in Europe. People are fascinated by these animal skins that are coming out of North America. Samuel D. Champlain establishes a trading post at Quebec. And if we go back to the map here, Quebec would be located right at this point, this mouth of the St. Lawrence River that is where it's narrowing into this point. So the French would sail in here. The Indians had been hunting all in the wilderness, and they're going to bring the animal pelts to the fort at Quebec, and then the French sailors will sail it back to to France and sell it. Where Samuel D. Champlain makes his mistake is that he aligns himself with the Algonquin Indian tribes. And we've mentioned before that the Algonquins were groups of natives that spoke a similar language. And the Algonquins were rivals with the Iroquois tribes. We've talked about the 5 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy. And the Iroquois live more on the eastern side of the St. Lawrence River, where the Algonquins are more on the western side. And Samuel D. Champlain is trading with these Algonquins, and they say, you know, by the way, we've got these enemies that live across the river. Would you be willing to help us out? And Champlain says, sure, because he believes if he helps out these Algonquin Indians and their rivalry with the Iroquois, then that's going to solidify his trade deals and get more on board with being able to make money from these beaver pelt. Well, they go after the Iroquois. They are very successful. They destroy a lot of the Indians who live there and their tribes. But the Iroquois have a long memory. And when we eventually will get to the French and Indian War, the Iroquois tribes are going to side with the English in the English war against the French, because the Iroquois are going to be arch enemies of the French. The other Indian tribes are on friendly terms with the French for sure, because of the trade relationship that goes on here. These French settlers are not going to be moving on to the outskirts of Quebec and encroaching on their lands. It is absolutely a trade relationship between them. Okay, the other group of French who will arrive here will be priests. So similar to the Spanish effort to try to convert natives to Catholicism, the Jesuit priests are going to do that as well. So a Jesuit priest is a Catholic priest whose job is to go out into the world and spread the word of, spread the Catholic tradition and to convert people and educate them about the Catholic faith. So these Jesuit priests have come to Quebec. They interact with the natives who are trading with the fur trade. And they pick up the language and they become trusted and that kind of thing. Well, as they're interacting with the natives, you know, that in the back of the minds of these French explorers, they're still curious about whether or not there's this Northwest Passage. And so the Indians keep talking about, oh, there's big water to the west. And they're like, well, maybe this is the Northwest Passage. So Father Jacques Marquette, over here, he's one of the Jesuit priests. He and Louis Joliet, who is an explorer, are going to set out in a canoe with some of the Indian guides to go and find this big body of water that the Indians are talking about, because again, they believe maybe the Northwest Passage. Well, what they end up finding, again, let me back up and show you the bigger map here. So they leave Quebec, they're going down the river, well, boom, all of a sudden they are in a big body of water, but that big body of water is what today we would call the Great Lakes. And if any of you've ever visited Lake Michigan or any of the other Great Lakes, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, they kind of look like an ocean. So as Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet are here, they enter the Great Lakes and they paddle through all of these lakes, and they paddle some more, and they think, well, maybe we're going to end up in the Northwest Passage. Well, they end up in Lake Michigan, and they're paddling here, and suddenly they're in a river and they're going in the wrong direction. They are going due south. So they've clearly realized that they have not found this Northwest Passage. So they turn around and they go back and they paddle, and they get back to Quebec, and they say, you know, we interacted with all these other tribes. There's more animal fur out there that we can negotiate with, and these natives are going to be willing to work with us in the fur trade. But no Northwest Passage. Okay, so then a little bit later on, Robert de La Salle, a couple of years later, is going to continue this path, right? So the Mississippi River, he's like, I wonder where that leads. Because if you think about the trading post at Quebec, the temperatures in Quebec, Montreal and Quebec, right? So here's Montreal, Quebec's going to be up in here. In the winter is incredibly cold. And so the St. Lawrence waterway is going to freeze over, and you can only trade certain times of the year. Well, Robert de La Salle, thinking to himself, all right, so Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, they traveled through here and they were going due south. I wonder if that could end up in the Gulf of Mexico, where the Spanish are located, and maybe that would give us a year-round warm water port that we can continue to trade with the Indians along the Mississippi River for animal furs, and we can expand the fur trade. So Robert de La Salle continues through the same route, paddles through the Great Lakes, gets into the Mississippi River, keeps going due south, and what do you know? He does indeed land here in the Gulf of Mexico, and he claims all of this land for the French king, who was Louis XIV. And so Louisiana is named in honor of King Louis XIV, and all of this is claimed. So all of this territory is going to become New France, claimed in the name of the French king, and they're going to call it Louisiana. And he sets up a fort here at New Orleans. But again, it's not going to become a thriving colony. You don't have entire families that move here. You have young single men who just kind of roam around in the wilderness, trade with the Indians, and then bring the animal fur to the forts. So this does not become a large settlement of a large population. And part of that's also because King Louis XIV is not interested in his subjects moving here out of his sight and out of his control. He's a very authoritarian leader. Okay, there's another settlement, New Netherlands. So here we've got Jamestown that's been established, Maryland is established. We've got New France that's over in the Great Lakes region. But we've also got the Dutch, who have created a settlement around this red dot that we would see here in what today would be New York and New Jersey. And this is going to be called New Netherland. And the Dutch at the time in Europe were by far the most wealthy of the European nations. They had established the best shipping industry of any of the Europeans. So whatever you have coming out of Jamestown, the tobacco, or the sugar that's coming out of Brazil or the Caribbean, chances are the ship that is or the fur coming out of New France, chances are the ships that are transporting that across the ocean would be owned by the Dutch. So I like to think of the Dutch at this time period as being sort of like the FedEx of the time period. Their job was to transport goods, and they charged a fee for that and made a lot of money. So when they established the colony at New Netherland here in North America, again, they really didn't intend for this to be a large populated settlement. They intended it more to be in trading posts, to use the ships that they already have to trade with the Indians in the interior and move those animal furs back to Europe. So when New Netherland was established, they created a settlement, a fort at Fort Orange, which today would be Albany, New York, the capital of New York. And that was the trading post for the Dutch. And again, it really, you didn't really have many Dutch people who settled there because things were going so well economically in the Netherlands. Why would you leave? There were no push factors for people to want to leave the Netherlands. So the people who ended up living in New Netherland were really from all of the other European countries that ended up settling in New Netherlands. So you already have a lot of variety, a lot of diversity within the Dutch colony here in North America. Henry Hudson had explored the region for the Dutch, again, looking for that Northwest Passage, because again, if they're the transporters, they want to have that Northwest Passage available to them. The Hudson River and the Hudson Bay will be named for Henry Hudson, this explorer who establishes this new Netherland, or this Dutch colony. All right, so when the Dutch have settled their colony, I want to show you some elements to the island of Manhattan. So this is the Manhattan Island, and you've got the fort here that's going to be called New Amsterdam. So New York City today would have been referred to as New Amsterdam when it was controlled by the Dutch. So the Dutch have two communities. You have New Amsterdam, which is right here on the coast, and then you have up the Hudson River, Fort Orange, which was where they were trading with Indians. They were worried about danger from the Indians, so they built this massive wall that crosses over Manhattan Island. So if you've ever been to New York City today, you've probably been to Wall Street. Well, if we overlay this map from when this was a Dutch settlement, Wall Street today is where the Dutch wall was located that kept the Indians out. Okay, so here was the fort down here at the tip of the island. If you've ever gone on the ferry boat that goes out from Manhattan to the Statue of Liberty and to Ellis Island, you left from this part of Manhattan Island, and you saw the remnants of the old fortification right here along the coastline of Manhattan Island. This road that goes up here that's really wide was known as Broadway because it's such a broad and wide street that went through the New Netherland, or the New Amsterdam settlement. And today, Broadway, we know where all the plays are located, kind of housed there in the heart of Manhattan. This would have been Broadway, and it goes up the island today. All right, so here's kind of the layout today. If we go to the southern part of New York City, the streets are all kind of curved and not really uniform in New York City today. But once you get above this older part of the city, this New Amsterdam part of the city, then it becomes perfectly square blocks. So what I love about going to modern cities today is kind of peeling back the layers and being able to see the history of a town or a city, in this case, New York City, by the structure of the streets and by the buildings that are still there. Here would be Wall Street today. So here's Wall Street, where the wall initially was, and then over time, New Netherland expanded, and you had these other streets that go the length of the part of this. So here's Broadway today, and it goes straight up the island of Manhattan. And then these would obviously be the modern blocks that we are familiar with, 17th Street, 23rd Street, that kind of thing. All right, and then the avenues would be going north-south. So today, here's Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange is located there, and you've got the subway, that there's a station, and then right outside of the Wall Street station, you've got the bull there, because when you're talking about the economy, you want it to be a strong bull market. When it's in a decline, we call it a bear market. So the bull is there outside of the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. So if we think about the United States today, New York is really the financial center of the United States. Well, what were those Dutch settlers? What was the Dutch colony for? Wasn't it for trade? It was about bringing in the animal fur from the interior and having this marketplace to ship things out. So again, if you go back to the roots of New York, this was all about economics in the settlement. Francis Tavern is one of the oldest operating taverns or bars / restaurant in the United States. And this was established during the colonial period. And even during the Revolutionary War, George Washington spent a lot of time here planning strategy at Francis Tavern. Later on, when he becomes president of the United States, he also has meetings here at Francis Tavern. So this was a very important place in America's history, and it's right down off of Wall Street, right near the Battery, where you would go and take the ferry to visit the Statue of Liberty. This is the Bowling Green. This was the first public park in the colonies, and it was established here as a place for people to congregate, and they would go bowling. So they had like lawn bowling where you would have grass and you would roll the, there was a game that they would play. There was also a large statue of the king that was here in the Bowling Green. And if we fast forward to the American Revolution, when the colonists declared independence and they read the Declaration of Independence out loud in New York City, the people of New York, they en masse, they marched down to the Battery and they tore down this statue of the king at the start of the Revolutionary War. And it used to be here at the Bowling Green. So as this was still in the possession of the Dutch, it was a struggling colony. Number one, they couldn't get the population to grow there. And again, people just didn't want to leave the Netherlands. They had trouble with the Indians, and there was very, very strict control by the governor that was in place in New Netherland. And that was this man, Peter Stuyvesant. Sometimes you hear it pronounced Stuyvesant. And here he is, he had his wooden leg, and he was the ruler here, or the governor of New Netherland. And he didn't allow any sort of legislature or assembly, any elected representation. He was the only government representative in New Netherlands. So people weren't gaining a whole lot by going here. He ends up losing control of the Netherlands when the English decide to take it. And the Dutch really don't put up any fight. Now, Peter Stuyvesant had already taken over New Sweden and combined that together. So that would have been kind of where Delaware is today. That was New Sweden. And then the Dutch had taken that over into one New Netherland colony. And the English had already established Jamestown. They had also established the New England colonies that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And separating the two was New Netherland that was in between. And the English are like, we want to connect these two coastlines, or these two colonies that are ours. They go in, they bring in these British ships, or English ships show up, and there's nobody who's willing to fight for Peter Stuyvesant, because again, remember, these are people from all different countries that are living in New Netherland. They have no loyalty to the Dutch nation. So they're like, okay, we'll be part of these English colonies. And so he has to stand down. It was a bloodless takeover. And now the English are in control of those colonies. So when they take control of New Netherland, these were already established colonies, and the English just take over the governance of it. And the area that used to be New Netherland, the King Charles II is going to give the colony to his brother James, who at the time was the Duke of York. So remember, he's kind of the younger brother. He's not king. His brother is the king. So he's given this as just a gift, and it's a proprietary colony. Proprietary, again, means that you own it. So James, the Duke of York, owns this colony. It is his to do with as he wishes and to govern any way he wishes. And James, they renamed the colony New York, right? Because he's the Duke of York. So it's no longer New Netherland, it's now New York. And New Amsterdam becomes New York City. So we get rid of those Dutch names, and we bring in the English control. But there's still going to be remnants of the Dutch colony that linger behind even today. We see some of those names, the old family names, the Dutch names that are reminiscent. So when the Duke of York is given all of this, so all of this is actually New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. This whole part here was given to the Duke of York, and he gives his buddies, John Berkeley and George Carteret, he gives them New Jersey. So he lops off part of his gift and makes them proprietary owners of New Jersey. And they're going to be allowed religious freedom there and a representative government. So that's New Jersey was again part of this New Netherlands settlement. If we look today at New York's diversity, it's one of the more diverse places that you will find in the United States. Incredibly large numbers of languages that are spoken in New York City. You have different little enclaves within New York City that are culturally similar. So you might have Chinatown, you might have Italians that Little Italy that's in one part of the city, you might have people of Polish descent that congregate in another part of the city. And this was a map that was done in 2014 based on the census data that shows us different enclaves of languages and cultures that are present here. So we've got Korean would be this lighter color blue. We would see pockets of Korean populations living in parts of the city. And you still hear these different languages. If you walk down the street in New York City today, you're going to hear all kinds of languages that are spoken. So I think it's neat to think about the diversity from when this was a colonial settlement of the Netherlands to its diversity today. And so we do see those elements continuing. All right, the Iroquois are going to be in a very strategic position. Here are the 5 tribes of the Iroquois, and they are between New France, the Algonquin speakers, and these Europeans, the French and the Dutch colonies. So this was the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Here you've got the Iroquois in between them and the French, and then once this is taken over by the English, the Iroquois are going to use this to their advantage. And they're going to start playing one side against the other with trade. And they start to expand and take over other areas, other Indian tribes in the Great Lakes region. And these become the Indian Wars, okay? The Indian Wars between the Iroquois and the Algonquins continue to become more and more aggressive. And they're known as the Beaver Wars. So you've got all different types of groups that are fighting and in and throughout the Great Lakes region. And the Iroquois end up getting the upper hand here, and they force some of the other tribes out. So the Iroquois expand their presence in the Great Lakes and force other tribes out during the Beaver Wars. Okay, the next group of colonies that we want to establish will be the New England colonies. And these are going to be founded for religious purposes for the most part. You're going to have very different groups of settlers. These are going to be families, the intact families that will move to North America to settle here. Where Jamestown, this was a colony, Jamestown was founded for economic reasons. This is founded for religious reasons, so you're going to bring your whole family. If you're being persecuted in England, the father in the family is not going to go and move to another colony and leave the wife and the children behind in this nation or this government that persecutes them. They're going to come here to New England for religious freedom. They will establish townships that will govern themselves, and they will have small-scale farming, subsistence farming that supports just their family. So we're not in commercial agriculture where we're growing tobacco by the thousands of pounds per year to send back to England to make a profit. We're here just to support our family. Small-scale farming, just what we need to grow to feed our family. The people who come to New England are known as Puritans, and I would really, really emphasize this in your notes. These are people who disagree with the way that the Church of England is operating. They believe that when Henry VIII created the Church of England, that broke away from the Catholic Church, they were happy that these Protestant reformers were so excited that the Church of England was going to be created to break away from Catholic traditions. But what they ended up finding was that the Church of England was really very, very similar to the Catholic Church. The hierarchy within the church, you had bishops, you had priests, and if you went to a Church of England service, you would have the same rituals, the same format for the service as you would if you went to a Catholic church. The only difference is, instead of the Pope, you had the king who was in charge of the Church of England. That was really the only difference. So these Puritans were people who were saying, wait a minute, if you're going to call yourself a non-Catholic Protestant church, then you need to not be Catholic. And so they're challenging the Church of England in the way that it's conducting itself. And they want to purify, think about it, the Puritans want to purify the Church of England. This is where they want to make those changes. Okay, so they leave England and they come here to North America, into New England. First group will arrive in 1620. The second group arrives in 1630. And they come as families. So we've got large numbers of families that will come here and establish the colony at New England. There are two kinds of Puritans, okay? One group, the separatists, they're the first group that will come to North America. They're going to be known as the Pilgrims. And my guess is that when you were back in kindergarten, you had your little Thanksgiving play, and you had the pilgrims, and you dressed up like pilgrims, and you had the first feast. All right, so this group of colonists, the Pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower, were known as separatist Puritans. They are permanently breaking from the Church of England. They will never, ever go back, right? So these are all Puritans. They are upset. They are dissenting from the Church of England because of its Catholic characteristics. But these separatist Puritans will permanently break away. They have no interest in going back and rejoining the Church of England. So they come on the Mayflower and they will settle in the Plymouth colony in 1620. Fairly small group, maybe about 100 people. There were 3 ships that come. The Mayflower was one of them, and again, it has a small group of colonists on board. Their leader is William Bradford. Okay, so I would make sure that I know his name. He was a very, very good leader, very fair, made good decisions, was very organized. So he was the leader of the Pilgrims. They're going to sign a document called the Mayflower Compact that we're going to read in class and that we're also going to talk more about in just a minute. And they are known for being very, very strict in their work ethic, right? We've got to all pull together. We're going to make this colony successful. They work very hard, and they're wanting to make this colony successful. They're not going to be dealing with the disease problems that they did in Jamestown because, again, the climate is much better. And they're also going to be somewhat religiously tolerant. So as long as you were working hard and you're not interfering with what the Pilgrims and the way that they wanted to worship, they were fairly tolerant of other religions here. The other group of colonists will come in a much larger group a decade later in 1630, and they were non-separatist Puritans. They are trying to prove a point by coming to this colony, and they want to be successful and to force the Church of England to adjust. And if the Church of England makes those changes where they don't have the Catholic traditions and the Catholic rituals as part of the Church of England anymore, then they want to come back and be part of the Church of England again. It's like they're protesting. So these are the protesters who want change, and then they're willing to come back and rejoin the church. These separatist Puritans, they're done. They are not going to go back. Okay? So this is the larger group. They go and they settle in Massachusetts Bay, which is close to Plymouth, but separate little settlement. And they have a much larger group. They're going to have close to 1,000 colonists, and they're going to be brought here on multiple ships. Their leader is a lawyer named John Winthrop, and he is very well spoken. He can command his audience, and he's very, very powerful. And people are drawn to him, right? They are willing to follow his lead. His speech, his famous speech to them, is known as the City Upon a Hill speech, or the Arabella Sermon, that we're also going to read parts of in class. Again, very, very strict work ethic. If you were not willing to work hard and make this community successful, you were going to be sent away, because any sort of detraction from the overall success of the colony was not going to be tolerated. And they are going to require, there's no religious toleration in Massachusetts Bay if you were not following the Puritan guidelines to the letter. You were going to be sent away. Okay, so these are all Puritans. Both groups have a conflict with the Church of England. It's the way they handle it that's going to be a little bit different. Okay, so the first group, the Pilgrim Separatists, they come here in 1620, and they were originally going to be settling within the area of the Virginia Charter. So remember, if we go back to the Virginia Company, they had that charter that was like from what today would be North Carolina all the way to New York, and all of that land in between was considered Virginia. Well, that was originally where they were headed, but there was a bad storm. Mayflower was blown off course, and they end up outside of the boundary of the Virginia Charter. And they knew that where they had landed was not where they had originally intended to go. So on board ship, before they get off the ship, all of the men are going to sign the Mayflower Compact. A compact is another word for an agreement. And the general gist of this compact is that they were going to agree to the will of the majority. Okay, so think about what they're doing. They're blown off course. They're landing in an area that's outside technically of what they think the jurisdiction is of where they're allowed to go. They are religious dissenters who are challenging the authority of the king in England and his church. It could be perceived that they've kind of gone rogue and that they're going to start their own country. And when we look at the text of the Mayflower Compact, they are very clear that they are loyal subjects of the king. They just don't like the way that the Church of England is being operated, but that they are still good Englishmen, and that they're going to live here in peace, and they're going to create their settlement. And because they're having to create something out of nothing, maybe there's disagreement. Maybe there's disagreement about where to build a fort, or what to do first, what crop to plant. And if you've got less than 100 people, and you've got some people over here wanting to do this and some people over here wanting to do something else as a priority, and you don't have agreement, nobody's going to survive, because all 100 people have to be working towards the same goal if they're ever going to be able to live and be successful in this wilderness area. So they signed the Mayflower Compact. A lot of people look at this as maybe kind of the first government agreement here in North America, in what becomes the English colonies, where they're agreeing to govern by what the majority would want. Okay, they are going to encounter groups of natives, and the leader of the native group that they encounter will be Massasoit. All right, so Massasoit is here their leader, and he and William Bradford agree to live peacefully, to coexist here. Again, there's going to be trade, and the natives are going to be showing them about growing corn and about crop rotation and all of that. To their surprise, there is one of the natives who already speaks English. How in the world did this happen? Well, Squanto had been captured by the Spanish actually earlier on, and was taken back to Europe and was sold to some people in England. He learned English and ended up working on a ship and getting himself back to North America. And when he comes back, his tribe was actually gone. He was absorbed into Massachusetts tribe, but he still understood and could speak English. So can you imagine when the English arrive and they find this Native American coming out of the woods who can speak English? It's almost too good to be true. And so they clearly believe that obviously God has landed them here where they've got this native that they can work together. So they do learn to hunt the land there and fish and farm and survive. And so that first winter, that first harvest, they do have this Thanksgiving meal that is, giving thanks for the bounty of the harvest that they've been able to work with together. And so it was a peaceful coexistence here in the beginning. But later, things turned very, very deadly. Massachusetts' sons had grown up and interacted with the English a lot and had taken these English names. And when his oldest son, Philip, took over when Massasoit died, he kind of was like a Pocahontas. He was not so sure that this was really the best way for the Wampanoag tribes, right? So here they are, the Wampanoag tribe, to handle the interaction with the English. He didn't think that they were being treated fairly. So they go to war. And this was known as the Pequot War. There was a Pequot tribe. You've probably never heard of the Pequot tribe, and there's a reason for that, because in the war, the Pequot War, which was Metacom's war is going to come later, but this Pequot tribe that had tried to go up against the English, they were wiped out. All right, so Metacom and King Philip, they're going to fight the English later. This earliest war is with the Pequots, and the Pequot tribe is completely wiped out. And look what this Puritan leader has to say. So this is Cotton Mather. He's going to be one of the Puritans that's living there, and he's describing the Indians. Probably the devil delivered these miserable savages to America and hopes that the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ would never come here. So he's looking at this as this supernatural situation where Indians and natives are savages and that they're the work of the devil and they're there trying to detract from their cause. So the Pequot tribe is very, very brutal. 1637, the English are going to team up with some of the native enemies of the Pequots, and they surround their village. So here's the village. It's got the fortification here, and they put these bow and arrows. They're going to set on fire like these flaming arrows, and they shoot it into the village, and it sets it all on fire. Well, then around the village, so these are the native groups that are shooting these are the Puritans' native allies are shooting the arrows into the Pequot village. And then as it's all on fire and the Indians start to run out of the openings here of the Indian village, then they're going to be shot to death by the Puritans with their guns. So it was a brutal, brutal destruction of hundreds and hundreds of Indians who lived in here in the Pequot War in the 1630s. The natives who remained in the surrounding area, the Puritans are going to try to convert them to their Puritan religious views. And they do this through what are known as praying towns. So think about if we could make this comparison with the Spanish. The Spanish are trying to convert the natives as well. You're going to have the Spanish missions. Here you have the praying towns where the English Puritans are going to try to convert natives. So the praying town, it would be where the Indians would come in. They would be forced to dress and cut their hair, take English names, and they weren't allowed to live as in their Indian tribal ways. Now, again, not terribly successful here. So these are all going to be in and around Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. So here's Plymouth, here's Massachusetts Bay and Boston, where the larger group had settled. Notice that there are none of these praying towns in and around Rhode Island, and we'll talk about why that is in just a minute. okay, and also none in Plymouth, right, because they were somewhat more religiously tolerant than those that had settled, the English who had settled in Massachusetts Bay. All right, so the Puritans who come to Massachusetts Bay, the non-separatists, want to demonstrate that God favors their decision, right? So if God is looking at the situation of the Church of England, and the Puritans have come over here to create their settlement in protest of the Catholic traditions of the Church of England, if they come here and they're successful, then clearly God agrees with them that the Church of England needs to shape up and change its ways. If they come over here to New England and they create this colony and it fails miserably, then God favors the Church of England in the way that it is. And so these non-separatist Puritans, they're very, very conscious of the image that they're presenting and the success that they want to demonstrate to the world to show the Church of England that they've got to change. All right, so John Winthrop arrives here in 1630, and here's John Cotton talking about that authority in the magistrates, liberty in the people, and purity in the church, right? This is what we've really got to achieve. We're going to have the people govern themselves in these town meetings, but the people who get to vote are members of the church. And the leaders here within the church become leaders within the community. It's all tied together. And before John Winthrop, before they leave, he gives this really famous speech, the City Upon a Hill speech, to the colonists on board the ships. The Arabella was the ship that he was on. There were multiple ships, but he was on that particular one. And it's basically telling the colonists, as we'll see in class when we read parts of it, that we don't have any room for people who are not on board with what they're being required to do. And if they are not agreeing with this approach, then they're going to have to leave. So it's very important that all of this be delivered in a way that the colonists are, they're not really in fear of John Winthrop, but because again, he's a lawyer by trade, so he by trade is very persuasive in the way that he speaks, and people follow him. So he is in charge completely. This phrase, the city upon a hill, you will hear over and over and over again in modern politics. And with this being an election year in 2020, my guess is as we get closer to the election and we start to have debates and speeches and that kind of thing by the candidates, we will probably hear reference to the city upon a hill at some point. These are just some examples of where we've heard it before. Now, John Winthrop, when he used this phrase, he took it directly from the Bible. So here we've got the city upon a hill that's being referenced in the Bible. So this is a statement from the Sermon on the Mount. And look what it says: you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, right? So if you're on a hill, everybody around you can see you. Nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all of the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So when John Winthrop is making this reference that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of the world are watching. So he's saying we're not going to hide over here and worship differently than the Church of England. We're going to be an example to everyone else to watch how we live and thrive and prosper, and therefore this is the best way to do it. John F. Kennedy in 1961, he is making reference to this as well. Look what he says: during the last 60 days, I have been engaged in a task of constructing an administration. Right? He's been newly elected. I have been guided by the standard John Winthrop set for his shipmates on the flagship Arabella 331 years ago, as they too face the task of building a government in a new and perilous frontier. What Kennedy is talking about in 1961 is the Cold War, right? Think about this new and perilous frontier where we've got to try to manage the growing danger that exists with communism around the world. So he says, we must always consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. That's what Winthrop said. Kennedy's saying today, the eyes of all people are truly upon us and our government in every branch at every level, national, state, and local. We must be as a city upon a hill, constructed and inhabited by men aware of their grave trust and their great responsibilities. If we want the rest of the world to turn against communism, then we need to be the example to show the world that this is actually the best place to live. All right, fast forward into the 1980s. So there was a Democrat, Kennedy, using the phrase city upon a hill. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, a Republican, is going to use it as well. Look what he has to say in 1984. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rock, stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. That's how I saw it, and that's how I still see it. So he's talking about the United States as this example to the world. How they govern their colonies. So again, this was tied in, their government was tied into their religion. And Boston was the seat of Massachusetts Bay Colony. They became a place of great merchant trade there in Boston. They had a joint stock company, Massachusetts Bay Company. It had investors. So again, they were going to make money there, but this was all about the example, the religious example. So being a good Puritan was required. And if you couldn't meet those standards, and it was hard to live by the policies that the leadership created. So they set up a government. They had a governor who was John Winthrop. They had an elective council and assembly made up of male church members. And they had town meetings where the church members would go and they would make decisions for how they would all operate. There was no gender equality. So the women had absolutely no say-so, no voice in the Puritan government or within the church as well. People who didn't meet these standards were forced out of New England, out of Massachusetts Bay. And there are two prime examples of this. One is with Roger Williams. We'll look at him first. He was actually a Puritan minister from Salem. And he began to question how the Puritans were dealing with the natives. As more people began to move to Massachusetts Bay, the settlements began to move farther and farther out from Boston and taking over native lands, and they were never paid for it. He also disagreed with the way that the leadership within the Puritan church was teaching the gospel, and that they were not able to have these own religious experiences themselves, that it relied on a minister to interpret the Bible for them rather than having an individual relationship with God. Roger Williams was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. So he was thrown out and he left Massachusetts Bay and he went and established his own colony in a community that he called Providence. And that becomes the colony of Rhode Island. When he got to Providence, he paid the Indians for their land. He was religiously tolerant. And what I like to think of with Rhode Island is pretty much anything goes, right? You can worship any way you want in Rhode Island. You could be a Christian. You could be, a Christian being either a Protestant or a Catholic. You could be Puritan. You could be Quaker. You could be Jewish. You could be an atheist. You could be an animist Indian. It didn't matter. Anyone was allowed to go and live freely in Rhode Island. Okay, so Roger Williams, he is banished from New England and he creates the new colony of Rhode Island, which is quite different from the others. So if we think back to the map when we saw the praying towns, why were there no praying towns in Rhode Island? Because he wasn't trying to convert the Indians to any sort of particular faith. All right, now Anne Hutchinson, here she is. Her story is fascinating to me. She was a married woman in New England and in Massachusetts Bay, and she was pregnant with her 15th child, And she was very outspoken, and she began to challenge the gender roles within the Puritan church. Because remember, women couldn't even be full members of the church, of the Puritan church. She was having religious meetings within her home, and she was interpreting passages of the Bible, which was horrifying to the leadership of Massachusetts Bay. So she was called into court and was charged with dissension among the Puritan believers. Now, can't you just picture this here? You know, her husband, he's not on trial here. It's Anne Hutchinson who's on trial. And I would be willing to bet that at some point in their home, he would be like, you know, can you just tone it down just a little bit? And she was very, very strong-willed, very, very intelligent, very smart. She defended herself in court, and guess who was representing Massachusetts Bay? John Winthrop, because remember, he was a lawyer by trade. She goes toe-to-toe with John Winthrop. She is not intimidated in the least. She does not back down. And they banish her for having religious services in her home that they believe is undermining the basic foundations of the Puritan church. So she's thrown out with her husband and her kids who still live with her, because with 15 of them, some of them have already, you know, reached adulthood by that point. So she goes to Rhode Island, and she and her family will live in Rhode Island for a period of time. After the Indian Wars get too dangerous, she and some of her children who still are living with her move to New York, and her husband dies. And then eventually she actually gets attacked and massacred by Indians, she and her surviving children. Now, some of the Hutchinson children do continue to live in Massachusetts, and I want you to remember that name. When we get closer to the American Revolution, there will be some Hutchinsons who will be involved in our story, and they are descendants of Anne Hutchinson. Okay, so here's Rhode Island. So again, you've got Roger Williams that leaves and sets up the settlement here at Providence. And he is known for religious toleration and the way that they treat natives. And Anne Hutchinson follows him there as well. Okay, Connecticut is another colony that forms. So if we go back here, Connecticut is going to be on the other side of Rhode Island. Connecticut is going to still be very, very devout to this Puritan ideal. And they are going to write their own constitution. But again, look what it has to say. The preamble it's going to bind all of the communities within Connecticut together under one goal. So look what it says. The people of Connecticut, acknowledging with gratitude the good providence of God in having permitted them to enjoy a free government, do in order more effectually to define, secure, and perpetuate the liberties, rights, and privileges of the people living there. So they actually write a constitution. And sometimes if you've seen a license plate from Connecticut, it says the Constitution State. They're not talking about the United States Constitution. They're talking about this colonial constitution that sets up the idea of outlining rights and responsibilities of people living within a certain area. So Thomas Hooker is the founder of Connecticut, the Connecticut colony, which was again more about this Puritan ideal. But it's saying that the authority of the government comes from the people giving the authority to the government. And that's going to be a very foundational element of the United States Constitution later on. So this Constitution of Connecticut, the colony of Connecticut, does have implications for the United States Constitution later on. Okay, the sequence of events here in England, as we know, there's going to be the English Civil War that breaks out because the Protestants had become more powerful in Parliament. So as Protestants become and the Puritans become more ingrained within Parliament, they're challenging the leadership of Charles I, the king, who is persecuting these Puritans. And they end up going and overthrowing the monarchy. So we would call this the English Civil War. And when they overthrow Charles I, here he is, he's being beheaded. And here they are holding Charles I's head. And when he is taken out of the monarchy, we create a new form of government that is led by the Puritans, and that's going to be Oliver Cromwell. So Oliver Cromwell becomes the leader of England during this time when the monarchy has been thrown out. Well, Oliver Cromwell becomes a dictator, and he is not popular and is not going to govern in the way that the Puritans would have hoped. So he ultimately, there's going to be this movement to restore the monarchy. You may have heard in world history that term, the Restoration. And that's what's going on here. They're trying to restore the monarchy. Well, obviously Charles I can't come in, but his son can, and they're going to try to overthrow Oliver Cromwell. So when they restore the monarchy, that's when they restore the son of Charles I. They bring in Charles II. He had been hiding out in exile in France during all of this. And when they bring back in Charles II, the Puritans in New England are very, very disappointed because they thought that the Puritan movement, this overthrow, this English Civil War, that this was their chance. Think about what they were doing. They were non-separatist Puritans. They wanted to change the Church of England, and they thought when Oliver Cromwell came in to power and overthrew the monarchy that it had worked, that they were going to be able to come back to England and that the Protestant Revolution would have worked. Didn't happen. So when Charles II came back in, he was more sympathetic towards various religious groups, but he was the one who ends up marrying the French princess, Henrietta Maria. And so he's sympathetic to the Catholics, and that's going back to his time being in exile in France. So things just are not going the way that the Puritans would have wanted. And by the 1690s, there is all kinds of trouble that is breaking out with people are paranoid that there are religious dissenters living among them. And one of those events will be the Salem witch trials. And this is in the 1690s. They believed in the supernatural. They believed that the devil and God were in a rivalry for people's hearts and minds here on earth. And so these events that would happen, if there was a plague that came through, then, the devil, that was the work of the devil. And if people had bad things happen to them, then they hadn't been devoted to God in the way that they should have. So over time, there began to be this mass hysteria in and around Salem, Massachusetts, which is near Massachusetts Bay. And this led to these trials of these witches. And where it started was with these young girls. And these young girls began having these seizure-like symptoms. And they would have these visions and these seizures, and people thought that they were possessed by the devil. And so they were all paranoid, what has gone on with these young girls? And so these young girls start making accusations. And one of the accusations that they make is that this woman from the Caribbean, this Black woman from the Caribbean, her name was Tituba, and she was in Massachusetts Bay. She was a woman who was working in one of the homes here as forced labor. And Tituba, being from the Caribbean, had a very different type of animistic religious foundation. And these girls claimed that Tituba had put a spell on them and that they had become these witches. Well, then it goes on from there. And there began to be more and more accusations around the community. And ultimately, there are 20 people who were executed, 19 of them were women, were executed for being witches in and around Salem. Well, there, of course, were no witches. Historians have gone back to try to figure out what really happened. Now, what eventually calmed this hysteria down is the accusations began to be made against people who were higher up in the government. And finally, people were like, this has gotten out of control. And so then they backed off of it. This was a map that was done by a historian, and he had gone back and researched where people were living in and around Salem. All right, so the original town of Salem was here along the Ipswich Road. So this was the original town. And as more people moved into the colony and more people were setting up their own homes, they were living farther and farther away from the main town of Salem. Well, the people who lived on the outskirts of town wouldn't have had as much money as the people living in town, because the people in town were the merchants. And as more people moved out here to Salem Village, which was much more rural, they were wanting to establish their own church. So the church was here in Salem town. It was really a long distance, and to be a good Puritan, you had to go into, you had to go to church all the time. It wasn't just for an hour or so on Sundays. And they wanted their own church out here in Salem Village, and the leadership, the Puritan leadership in Salem town, refused to allow them to have that. So what these historians have done is they began to look at the people who were accusing others of being witches, those who were accused, or W with a circle around it, and then people who were standing up and defending those who were accused. And we began to see a very interesting geographic trend here. So all of these clusters of people who are accused of being witches are fairly close to Salem town and the Ipswich Road. So these would have been more affluent people in town. All of these people with the D would be defenders of these folks who are accused of being witches. There's only one accuser anywhere close to Salem town, and that's this person right here. But then when we get into Salem Village, look at all of the people who do the accusing. So is this really, if we start to try to look at the root causes of the Salem witch trial, yes, it's an interesting story about people, being accused of witches and that kind of thing. But is there some sort of underlying economic disparity between these two groups and how the community has grown and developed? Is this more about economic differences? Is this more about a rivalry between this group of people not wanting this other group of people to have their own church? Could there be more to this? And I think that this is an interesting way that this historian has been able to take evidence and plot it out and map it out to be able to make more interpretations. So again, this is something that I think makes history very interesting. Okay, the last thing that we want to mention here is the instability. So we've got the intact colonies. We've got these southern plantation colonies in and around the Chesapeake. We'll talk more about the Carolinas and Georgia in chapter 3. We've got the New England colonies up here, and then we've got the former Dutch colonies of New Netherland that have now been acquired by the English, and it's all contiguous, right? So we've got the coastline of the Atlantic that is now all under the control of the English. So who are the big losers in all of this? And that's going to be the Native American tribes. So as more English settlers begin to move inland from these coastal communities, if we look at the initial communities, look at Boston, Plymouth, Providence, New York City, Philadelphia, Jamestown, all of these are right on the coast. But as these settlements grow, people move further into the interior and they're encroaching on Indian lands. So these are some of the conflicts and situations that we have with the natives, and they become more and more violent as time goes on. So we have this peaceful time in the 1620s with the Wampanoags and Squanto working peacefully together with the Pilgrims. We've got the Dutch that actually purchased from the Indians Manhattan Island in 1626. That's before the English took control. But then things turn violent. We've got the Pequot War that leads to the praying towns and the movement of the Pequot, or the removal of the Pequot tribe from in and around Mystic. And then we end up with King Philip's War that we're going to talk about in just a second, Bacon's Rebellion, and the Pueblo Revolt. So by the 1670s, the population in these 40 years has dramatically increased, and the tension between the English colonists and the Indians is at a breaking point. So first and foremost, we want to talk about King Philip's War. So King Philip is actually, his Indian name is Metacom. He took an English name when he was a young man. He was Massasoit, the Wampanoag chief. It was his son. And they were constantly going back and forth in and around Boston and interacting. And so he had this English name. Well, when he becomes the chief, he's had enough. His people are in trouble, and so they attack. And it is a brutal war that will last for almost 2 years. And you've got large numbers of colonists that are killed. You have large numbers of Indians who are killed, and Metacom is the one who's putting all of these tribes together to go up against the English. And eventually, how this ends is Metacom, also known as King Philip, is captured, and he is beheaded, and they also cut his hands off. And these religious Puritans, right? Now think about this. These are Puritans who are settling this colony for religious purposes. They take this brutal event of the capture and beheading of Metacom, and they put his head on a stake, and they parade it through town in Boston. And then his hands are cut off, and it's either his head goes to Boston and his hands go to Plymouth, or the other way around. I don't remember quite which. But bottom line, it is a brutal, brutal dismemberment of this Indian leader to send a message to the other natives, don't encroach on our territory. And so again, this was a very, very terrible, terrible time for the native tribes. Okay. One of the only successful Indian revolts, and I want to emphasize that this was a successful revolt of Indians, was in the desert Southwest in what today we would call New Mexico, and this was against the Spanish. So the Pueblo Indians, those that were living in these groups, these Pueblo tribes in and around the desert Southwest, they fall under the leadership of Pope, and here he is. And he organizes these tribes to go up against the Spanish-controlled areas. So the Spanish had set up these missions in remote areas outside of Mexico City, and had hoped to convert natives. And they had had enough. Pope gets these tribes together. They go and they capture Santa Fe, and they force the Spanish out. And they have won this revolt. Later on, a number of years, and this was when Pope was thought to be an agitator, and he had been captured and put in prison by the Spanish, and then the tribes come and get him out, and then they claim Santa Fe. It's not going to be permanent. Eventually, Pope will also be killed, and the area is reclaimed by the Spanish. But for a while, this has been successful, and it has worked. So you would want to remember this as a successful Indian revolt. The California mission system, the more remote areas, the Spanish are going to set up these missions as a way of trying to convert natives. And this comes from the Pueblo Revolt. They feel like they need to keep closer tabs on what's going on in these remote areas. So the California mission system is all of the Pacific coastline of what today is California. And this was a place where the natives, when things were desperate for them, whether they were facing some sort of outbreak of disease or famine, they would go to these missions, and this would be where they would receive help and support. And the hope was that they would convert to Catholicism. Basically what happened was the religious experience of the natives became a blend of some of their traditional native ways with that of Catholicism. And the old Spanish missions, a lot of them you can still go and see today, and they're beautiful. The one in San Diego is beautiful. There's also one here in San Francisco. The San Francisco mission is again, just a great place to go. And if any of you grew up in California, I think it's when you're in 4th or 5th grade. It's a state requirement that all students in California schools in either 4th or 5th grade, they have to go and visit one of these Spanish missions to learn about the California history, the pre-history before California became part of the United States. So this mission system, again, you can go and visit some of those. All right, the last thing that we want to talk about today is Bacon's Rebellion. And this also starts as a conflict with natives. And this is based in Jamestown. So we're back in Jamestown. So I would definitely highlight this in my notes, that Jamestown, as tobacco takes off and becomes so very lucrative here in the 1600s, in the late 1600s, 1670s or so, tobacco's land intensive. So the land's coming from the natives, and the tribes are getting pushed back farther and farther. And the indentured servants, once they've worked off their indenture and they want to set up their own farms and their own land, they're going to be getting it from the outskirts of town where the Indians are, and it's not as safe. And the people living outside of town tend to be less wealthy than those living in Jamestown. They also don't have any sort of pull within the House of Burgesses, that legislature, to be able to make decisions. But when the people living on the outskirts of town are having trouble with Indians, they go to the House of Burgesses and they're asking for help, right? These are people who are paying taxes. They want some sort of military operation to go in and clear the land of the Indians, to protect them, either or some sort of fortification to be built to keep the Indians out. And they're told no. Now, by this time, Virginia had become a royal colony, and the king had sent to govern there William Berkeley. And William Berkeley is the royal governor. And to keep his place secure within the House of Burgesses, he had basically bought off wealthy members of Jamestown. He's providing them with tax exemptions where they don't have to pay what everybody else does for their land holdings. They're not having to pay certain taxes for their exported tobacco. And he's keeping the wealthy happy to protect his job as governor. So when the poor people, the former indentured servants, are asking for help, all of these folks in the House of Burgesses are kind of under the control of William Berkeley, who's bought their favor. And they ignore the people on the outskirts of town. Well, there's this new guy who's moved to town. His name is Nathaniel Bacon, and he was the son of a very wealthy and powerful man back in England. But Nathaniel Bacon was always in trouble, and his father couldn't control him. And he was like, young man, you need to grow up and you need to learn some responsibility. So you need to go and live in the colonies for a while and learn what it means to engage in hard work. And he's like, yeah, whatever, Dad. So he shows up in Jamestown, but because he's from an affluent family, he is immediately kind of brought into this aristocratic scene, but he's always kind of looking for, not really looking for trouble, but he kind of is not going to just go along with whatever. He kind of likes controversy. So when these people out on the outskirts of town are told no for their getting their help with the natives, Nathaniel Bacon's like, wait a minute, let's just go take care of this ourselves. So Nathaniel Bacon joins up with these people living outside of Jamestown to fight against the natives. Well, William Berkeley has said absolutely not. Do not attack the Indians because, oh, by the way, William Berkeley is getting trade goods from the Indians. So he's on peaceful terms with the Indians because he's getting something from them. He's getting, trade items, whether it's fur or whatever, and they're getting things from William Berkeley. And so the last thing William Berkeley wants is to make the Indians angry because that's going to hurt his financial security. Well, Nathaniel Bacon doesn't care, so he and the rebels go up against the Indians, and they cause this conflict. And William Berkeley is absolutely furious with Nathaniel Bacon for encouraging this, and William Berkeley puts Nathaniel Bacon in prison. Well, Nathaniel Bacon stirs up the rebels again, who now look at him as their hero, right? He's this wealthy guy who's actually paid attention to their needs. And he writes a manifesto. So this is Bacon's manifesto, which we'll also look at in class. You want to make sure that you're clear. A manifesto is like a statement of beliefs. And so he is writing about his manifesto is writing about that the people of the colony will not be ignored, and just because they're poor. And he is saying that people of a lower class deserve to have an equal footing and stand in the government. They will not stand for a government that ignores the needs of the people. And so all of the people are like, oh my gosh, Nathaniel Bacon, he's our hero. So when Berkeley puts him in jail, the rebels and Nathaniel Bacon, they come and they get him out of jail, and they're going to protest William Berkeley, and they burn Jamestown to the ground. So it is a huge controversy, and Berkeley is he's trying to justify what he's doing to the king. The king's like, I'm hearing something's going on in Jamestown. What is the problem? And so Berkeley's trying to blame all of this on Bacon. And there is just complete unrest in Jamestown. Well, in the middle of all of this, burning down Jamestown, Nathaniel Bacon gets a terrible, terrible case of dysentery, which was not unusual at the time. Dysentery is a fancy word for terrible, terrible diarrhea. He gets incredibly dehydrated and he suddenly dies. Well, when the leader of this group of rebels is suddenly gone, then the rebellion dies down, because many of these people, they're followers. Bacon is their leader, and Berkeley's going to go after them. So the rebellion falls apart when Nathaniel Bacon dies. We kind of saw this in King Philip's War when Metacom was killed and executed. The rebellion of the Indian dies down. And this is something that we'll see. When you remove a leader from a rebellion, the rebellion tends to fall apart. So that's what went on with Bacon's rebellion. But the importance here, this is the critical takeaway from Bacon's rebellion. This is an event that demonstrates that the people of the American colonies, the average person, will not tolerate being ignored by the wealthy. So this is demanding equal access or equal protection under the laws, which is a foundation of the United States. All right, so again, you can see how much they've spread. So in 1650, just the area in yellow had been settled in and around Jamestown, but within 50 years, all of this in green had been taken over for tobacco plantations. And if we superimpose this with Indian villages, look where all the Indian villages are located within the Powhatan tribes. So this is definitely causing conflict with the Indians. All right, so this is also happening at about the same time that we see this shift in labor. So Bacon's rebellion, these are former white indentured servants who are poor, who are fighting against what they believe is inequality within the government. After Bacon's rebellion, the labor source will shift very, very rapidly to enslaved labor from Africa. So the white indentured servants, there's a couple of reasons for this. One, the economy in England has stabilized and not as many people are willing to become indentured servants and come to the colonies. But two, you've got this situation with Bacon's rebellion where these former indentured servants are causing more and more trouble within the colony, demanding equal access, and the aristocrats are worried about it. Then they shift, instead of hiring indentured servants to come in and work for a, short period of time, they're going to now invest in enslaved labor that will permanently work for them on their tobacco farms and plantations, and not have to worry about these lower classes of whites. But here's the shift. When we shift to, in Jamestown, when the shift becomes a more enslaved labor source, then the lower class whites and the more aristocratic whites end up aligning more closely together, and it becomes racialized. So where this is racialized later on, it was more economic class distinctions when you had indentured servants. So there's definitely a shift, and I think this is a pretty good graph that shows that, where when people are dying off more rapidly with the starving time, right, when Jamestown was formed, you had these white indentured servants that were coming in large numbers. But then when things begin to stabilize economically and being able to survive longer in Jamestown, then we see the shift into enslaved labor. Okay. So there you have it. I hope, again, that you watched this in segments and didn't sit here and watch this whole lecture of chapter 2 at one time. But there is a lot happening here. You've got the regional characteristics of the various colonies, the southern plantation colonies, the New England colonies established for religious purposes, and then the middle colonies, as we call them, that were acquired from the Dutch and made into more merchant classes. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope that you were able to follow the changes here that are happening economically, politically, and socially within the English colonies. And we will pick up with chapter 3 next time.